Hey Wargamers, in our ongoing discussion of the Tau Index in 10th edition, I wanted to take a look at anti-tank units. That is because basically we have a pretty good idea about what the best units are for a bunch of different roles in the army, right? We know that Tetras are the best observers. We know that Breachers are the best anti-infantry, right? We have a pretty good handle on many different components of the list, and you see consolidation, you see convergence across lists in those elements. However, one of the areas that you see more diversification and variation across lists is in the anti-tank slot. Are you taking Skyrays? Are you taking broadsides? Are you relying on crisis suits? Are you taking storm surges, riptides, right? There are a whole bunch of different options that you have, and all of them tend to show up in lists for one reason or another, right? When we're talking about conceptually anti-tank units, we're looking at broadsides, skyrays, hammerheads, storm surges, crisis suits. Those are really the anti-tank units, right? And there are alternatives, right? You could just saturate a unit with breacher fire. We'll talk more about that later. But for the most part, these are the units that we're talking about, and all of them tend to show up in lists in one way or another. And so today I want to take a closer look at that. In many videos that we've done in the past, we evaluate offensive point efficiency, where we're looking at how much damage they do per point spent. We're going to do that again today, specifically for anti-tank units with anti-tank loadouts. But this tends to ignore a lot of how the game functions, right? And so in addition to reevaluating these units from that more analytical perspective, I also want to talk about things like their durability, our mobility, interactions they have with the army as a whole. And so that's what we're going to do, focusing on these 5 different units here, seeing how they stack up against a variety of vehicles and monsters in 10th edition 40k. All right, so looking at this offensive point efficiency here, we're going to break it down target by target. Again, looking at the target profile exclusively, not taking into account special rules or mitigations that unit has in reality, and just looking at the damage that you get per point invested in each of these units and how that varies based on their loadout. So here against a Star Weaver, which is toughness 6, 4-up save, 6 wounds, crisis suits overcharging cyclic ion blasters are by far the most efficient choice. However, again, there are alternatives, right? You could select broadsides with rail rifles and plasma rifles, and if you did that, you would get about 74% of that efficiency from that unit, right? So compared to crisis suits overcharging cyclic ion blasters, you have 74% efficiency with broadsides with rail and plasma. That drops down to 65% for crisis suits firing fusion blasters, 61% for a riptide overcharging its ion accelerator, 58% for a skyray, 43% for a hammerhead with a railgun, 27% for a storm surge with a blast cannon. These are a pretty wide range of values here. And so the crisis suit having the top slot overcharging cyclic ion blasters makes a lot of sense, right? We see cyclic ion blasters being extremely potent when they're overcharged, but if they're not overcharged, they really just don't have the damage output to deal with monsters or vehicles. So the overcharged cyclic ion blaster being top dog here, again, makes sense. Broadsides, 74%, also very respectable. I think once you get below 75%, you really kind of are out of contention for that role. That 75%, losing 25% of your efficiency is a really big drop. But within that, I think there's room for discussion. So broadsides here versus crisis with overcharged cyclic ion blasters, I think there's a discussion to be had there. For things like the Skyray, Hammerhead, Storm Surge, it just doesn't make a lot of mathematical sense to invest points in that way because you're looking at half the output, essentially. So that's kind of a way that we're going to look through these different units here. Let's move on to the Lehman Russ. Right, so the Lehman Russ, the poster child of a vehicle in 40k, right? Toughness 11, 2-up save, 13 wounds. Now we see broadsides with rail and plasma being the top slot, and you maintain pretty good efficiency going down the list here, right? 85% for the blast cannon storm surge, 84% with the railgun hammerhead, 61% on Overcharged Crisis, 59 for Skyray, 55 for Crisis with Fusion, and then 46 for the Riptide with the Ion Accelerator, right? And so here again, for this target, we're looking at Broadside, Storm Surge, Hammerheads as being, relatively comparable. The Crisis suit, now we're getting closer to half the output. So again, kind of putting itself out of contention from this angle. We'll talk about other angles in just a minute. The Land Raider, toughness 12, 2 up, save 16 wounds. Storm Surge now is coming out on top with the Blast Cannon. Again, maintaining pretty high efficiency across our units here. 94% for the Broadside with the Rail Rifle and Plasma Rifle. 94% with the Hammerhead and Railgun again. 72% for Overcharged Cyclic Ions on Crisis. And then we get down to 65% for the Skyray, 65% for Fusion Suits, 54% for the Riptide, overcharging again. So again, in this case, those units really aren't pulling their weight, but Storm Surge, Broadside, Hammerhead all do fairly well into the Land Raider. All right, moving into something with an invulnerable save. Here we have the Hive Tyrant, toughness 10, 2 up, save 16 wounds, 4++. Again, the intuitive choice here is going to be the Broadside because it has the Heavy Rail Rifle, which has devastating wounds, right? Devastating wounds punches through that invulnerable save really nicely. It does a ton of damage even without that. So we do see the Broadside coming out on top here. 85% for Overcharging Cyclic Ion Blasters, largely due to volume of fire here. 77% on the Hammerhead, 64% on the Skyray, 52% on the Storm Surge with Blast Cannon, 46% with a Fusion Blaster Crisis Suit. Look at that difference, right? 85% for Overcharging Cyclics, 46% for Fusion Blasters. That's the power of the invulnerable save and volume of fire on the Cyclic versus the Fusion Blaster. So, and then 46% for the Riptide as well. Stepping up to a Wraith Knight, toughness 12, 2 up, save 18 wounds, and a 4++ again. Cyclic Crisis, Overcharging again, show up here. 98% on the Broadside. Again, these two very evenly matched here. The Crisis is effective here due to volume of fire. The very nice contained package, doing multiple damage and having nice volume of fire. Broadside having that invulnerable save, mitigating devastating wound ability, and just bringing a lot of damage. Also works very well. Storm Surge coming in here at 72% efficiency with the Blast Can, 69% with the Skyray, 68% with the Hammerhead, 54% with the Crisis and Fusion Blasters, and also 54% with the Riptide again. And then our last unit that we'll look at here, the Imperial Knight, toughness 12, 3 up, save 22 wounds, and a 5++. Again, very similar to our last rankings. Crisis with Overcharged Cyclics are going to be on top here. 88% of that efficiency being found in Broadsides with Rail, 74% with Storm Surges with the Blast Cannon, 74% for Skyray, 69% for Hammerhead, 54% for Crisis with Fusion, and 54% for the Overcharged Riptide. All right, so we have a pretty clear picture here that Crisis with Cyclic Ion Blasters and Broadsides with Heavy Rail Rifles really are the way to go in terms of offensive point efficiency against these targets. But of course, that's not the whole story, right? If we're looking at durability, these units vary widely in their durability. And so I did some back of the envelope calculations here, just calculating the number of lascan hits it would take to remove one of these models, and then using that as a denominator in a ratio of their points cost, right? So the points per lascan hit to removal is the number that I'm showing here on this slide. Storm Surges are really expensive for the durability that they bring, right? 18 points per lascan hit to removal. That's not, the gold standard metric. That's not, the only weapon that you're going to encounter, but it does seem like a fairly decent benchmark considering that lascannon profiles are generally, an anti-vehicle, heavy unit removal tool. So having that as our baseline here, I think is reasonable. Storm Surges against that particular weapon don't hold up very well in comparison to the points that you pay for them relative to these other options, right? Broadsides with drones, if you're bringing broadsides and, bump them up to 10 wounds with shield drones, then you're looking at 15 points per hit to removal. Crisis suits with shield drones and a shield generator, giving them an invuln save is very helpful here. And so they actually have a pretty decent cost at 13 points. And then the Hammerhead is dirt cheap, right? The Hammerhead for its durability is pretty darn cheap at only 8 points per lascan hit for removal. So we see this relationship here with, broadsides being a little bit more expensive in terms of durability compared to crisis suits, assuming you take the shield generator. If you don't take the shield generator, that cost difference goes away, right? That you're not seeing the benefit of the crisis suit as much because it doesn't have an invulnerable save then. But assuming you do give it a shield generator, crisis suits are going to be the cheaper unit to invest in from a durability standpoint. We also have to think about positioning, right? Broadsides are relatively small, at least smaller than storm surges and hammerheads, and so they're easier to position, easier to move. You can break them up into units of one if you wanted to, which is often the way that I run them is in units of one or two. So having broadsides as small individual units allows you more flexibility, allows you more board control, allows you better firing mitigation because smaller units are going to be harder to remove than one large unit. And because they're small, you can give them good line of sight and all that sort of thing. All that sort of stuff. Hammerheads, on the other hand, are big. They're hard to move. The way that fly has been changed, the way that vehicles move around terrain now, means that, hammerheads are potentially difficult to position. And so that is a cost associated with them. Yeah, you have, kind of mediocre output in terms of their damage output, and a relatively cheap model for the durability of it, but it's hard to move. Storm surges, kind of in the same boat, right? They are very hard to move, harder than hammerheads, but they are towering. And so you have a lot of flexibility provided to you by that, but they're expensive. And, you're paying a lot for what you get in most cases. Crisis suits, on the other hand, are relatively cheap. They're fast. You can take them in units of, 3 or 6. They can be augmented significantly by having a commander in their unit. But they do have limited range. All right. We're talking about 18-inch range here on cyclic ion blasters. Shorter if you're talking about fusion blasters. And so you do have to get close. That does have a mitigating impact on their efficiency because you're not able to fire them every turn. And you also are more vulnerable to counter charges and that sort of stuff. Of course, you do have strike and fade as an option, but that costs you CP, a whopping 2 CP to jump, shoot, jump. So, and you can only do it with one unit, right? So there are, mitigating factors there that do tune crisis suits down to be not as amazing as they potentially could be. And of course, if we're looking at this offensive unit efficiency, this is primarily considering overcharging on cyclic ion blasters, right? And that does bring a cost, especially for a unit like crisis suits that can be easily removed given the number of weapons that you're firing and the total wound count on these models. Keep in mind they are vehicles, and so when you when you fail an overcharge test, you're taking 3 mortal wounds every time. And so it's not something you want to overcharge every single turn, but when you have the opportunity to fire crisis suits with cyclic ion blasters against, a Hive Tyrant or a Wraith Knight or a Titan, you're going to want to do that because that's going to give you a really good bang for your buck, at least in that instant. If you start losing models to overcharging, then it's a different story. But if you can make it through relatively unscathed, you're going to get a good return on your investment there. All right, so what about those alternative units, right? We've talked about crisis suits, we talked about broadsides pretty extensively, but there are other units aside from the ones that we even talked about, right? I mentioned at the beginning of the video breachers, right? Breachers, if you watch my earlier videos, breachers are insanely efficient against almost everything, just based on the number of shots that they put out. Having the Fireblade in there makes a huge difference, and they're really efficient little dudes. And so they offer you a lot of efficiency if you can get them where they need to be when you need them to be there, right? But they're super short range. They're transport dependent. You have to pay for that Devilfish too. And they are very likely better used against other targets, right? You are much better off bringing your breachers to take care of something that they really are, the best at. Taking out a unit of infantry, for example, they're going to be much more effective at that than a broadside would be. And so, use your breachers against the infantry and use your broadside against the vehicle, right? That kind of limiting factor mindset is going to be really efficient, and not just take a one unit one unit fits all approach to dealing with your opponent's army composition. Also, looking at like Barracudas, Tiger Sharks, they showed up pretty frequently in our earlier analyses, but they have a limited application, right? They have some benefits in the way that you can affect board positioning and deal damage, but you need to wait at least until turn 2, if not turn 3, if you're talking about technically rules is written for the Tiger Shark, to use them, because they're flyers. They're coming in from reserve, and because of the size of the base on the Tiger Shark, you have to wait an extra turn to actually do anything with it. So, you really are having a reduced utility of this unit because of that requirement of how it's deployed. And so that is certainly something that's worth considering, and generally something that people consider not to be worth it, right? And then the Taunar, right? The Taunar has its moments in that in our earlier discussions about efficiency, it does show up as being relatively impactful in certain places, but it's giant. And it has a big footprint, and it's a big investment. Not everyone can, practically get a Taunar either, right? And so in a lot of ways, it's a super storm surge, right? You're putting a lot of eggs in one basket. And so that generally limits opportunities for the rest of your army. You can't get as many other units on the table, which in a game that's about being in the place to do the things with tactical missions, having one giant unit in the center of your deployment zone really isn't that tactically sound, right? Yeah, it might pack a big punch, but it's not about just punching. You got to move and dip and dodge again, right? So the Taunar may have some appealing elements, but ultimately kind of undermines the more tactical, strategic play of the game. So in general, what do I think are the best options? Well, again, broadsides and crisis suits, right? We've kind of been ringing this bell over and over throughout this video, but it really does make sense, and it's worth putting a fine point on. Broadsides offer a lot. They offer high damage, good range, good durability. You can position them well due to their size and unit size as well, not just their base size, but the size of the unit. You can't dish take a single crisis suit. So being able to dish take one broadside has its advantages. Cyclic Ion Blaster crisis suits are flexible. Cyclic Ion Blasters in general perform well, whether they're overcharged or not. But when you're talking about an anti-tank weapon, overcharging that Cyclic Ion Blaster is fantastic, assuming you preserve the unit. So you overcharge it when you need it. You don't overcharge it when you don't. It's that simple. Determining about when you need it, though, that's the more complex part. That's the more kind of big brain strategy that has to go on. But, overcharge it when you need it against vehicles. That's going to be a good trade for you, but overcharging against other things might not be. If you don't overcharge it, fusion blasters, even outside melter range, can do a lot of damage. That is what this calculation is generally assuming you're not going to be within 9 inches 6 inches to use the melter range on fusion blasters, because fusion blasters are 12 inches now. Yeah, we're assuming that we're outside melter range for the most part here. And even then, they're going to be able to pack a punch against a lot of different units. And if you really need that extra bump, getting them up nice and snugly can be good, especially if you have Farsight, right? Farsight allows you some perks when you're within 9 inches. So having that benefit with Farsight in a unit is also worth considering. But ultimately, I think an army comprised of crisis suits kind of for your main damage dealing force combined with broadsides is going to be the best ways for you to deal with monsters and vehicles. And then, looking to support from things like Tetras and Breachers for anti-infantry is going to be a good way to go too. So overall, looking at those units as kind of our staples for the heavier end of the enemy army composition. So let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and happy wargaming. If you stuck around to this point in the video, maybe you want to join our Discord community as well. There's a link in the description below. Special thanks to all my supporters over on Patreon, but especially the folks that you see on your screen now. If you want to help make more invasive wargaming videos, consider joining our community over there as well.